Hey everyone, George here and welcome back to the channel. Feeding your fish sounds like a simple task, something we do every single day in this hobby, but are you doing it correctly? That's a question I get asked a lot, and the other question I get is what kinds of food should I be feeding my fish? When we come back, we're going to talk about that. We're going to get all kinds of information to you about what you may or may not be doing right, and what you could be doing better. So hang in there with me and we'll be right back. Welcome back everybody. So what I was talking about in the intro was how we feed our fish, whether or not we are feeding them a proper diet, whether or not we are giving them food on a schedule that is good for the fish, good for you. Many of us work and can only feed our fish at certain times of day. There are automatic feeders out there that you can use. I don't believe in those sorts of things simply because they don't measure food correctly and oftentimes create an environment in your tank that is not conducive to a healthy tank. So I like to suggest that you feed your fish on a regular basis, on a regular schedule, and try to feed them a diet that is rich in both live foods, frozen foods, pellets, and flake. That way, if you have a community tank such as this, you're covering all your bases for feeding all the fish in your tank. Now, you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can feed your fish a couple of times a day, which is what I recommend, and you can feed them a variety of things so that all of the fish in the tank, whether it be your tetras who are taking up basically this middle section of the tank, or your discus, which are taking the middle to the top section of your tank, you can look at these different aspects of what is necessary to keep your fish healthy, and you can feed them accordingly. Now, my suggestion, as I said, is a well-balanced diet. It's so important that your fish are getting things in their diet that are going to make them healthy. Now, there's a lot of foods out there that are expensive. They're not much better than any food that you can get that is a less expensive food sometimes, but sometimes they are. It just really depends on who you're getting your food from and what type of food that it is. Now, frozen foods to me are something that I find to be easy to just drop into your tank, and you get a variety of things in the frozen foods that you don't get in pellets or flakes or live foods. Now, live foods become difficult simply because they're not always available. Now, during the pandemic, that was a good example of people who, friends of mine that kept discus that were having problems getting blackworms, but that was all they were feeding their fish for so long that it was hard to get them off that and get them onto something else. And then all of a sudden, blackworms weren't available any longer, and they ran into a lot of problems. In fact, several of my friends lost several fish who really got thin and refused to eat anything else. So you want to try to get your fish, number one, to eat a variety of foods, not one particular food that is going to be the only food that they will eat. If you get them into a habit of doing that, you're going to run into problems the very first time there's some kind of crisis where you can't get that food any longer, and it can be a real problem for you. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about frozen foods, like I said, pellets, flake foods, and also live foods, and how I think those should be fed to your fish, and the kind of schedules that I think that are important, especially for perhaps maybe some discus fish or something like that are high-end fish who really need the nutrition and need different kinds of foods in order to keep them healthy. When we come back, we'll get into that a little bit more. We'll be back in just a minute. Now, I'm not a huge advocate for feeding live food to any of your fish simply because live foods are very difficult to get consistently. We learned with the pandemic, as I said earlier in the segment before this, that if you are feeding live blackworms or something like that to maybe your discus or other fish, all of a sudden, as many of you know around the country, there was a shortage of blackworms, and it became very difficult for some people to get out of the habit of feeding their fish these live foods, and then they became more and more scarce, and at some point many people were unable to get them at all, and their fish just wouldn't eat anything else. The important thing to do when you are raising fish and you have a community tank is to put a variety of foods offered up to your fish that they will eat if something goes wrong where you can't get live foods any longer. I'm not saying don't feed live foods at all. I'm not an advocate for that, but I am saying that if you are doing that, I want you to make sure you understand that if something goes wrong, you're going to have a real problem on your hands. So it's important that your fish are getting a diet that particularly is void of, your fish depending on a particular live type of food, such as blackworms. It's red worms. I don't even believe in feeding red worms unless they're frozen to your fish, simply because they carry a lot of parasites, and that's a whole nother subject that I don't want to get into right now. But I really believe that if you can avoid feeding live food to any of your fish, you're probably doing yourself a favor, simply because we've seen, like I said, with COVID, that there are things that can happen that can cut you off completely from the availability of live foods, and then you're kind of stuck if your fish won't eat anything else. Now, the best way to start this out is when you get fish, they're going to be bullheaded sometimes. In particular, discus fish will do this. They will be used to a particular food. What you should do is find out what kind of foods they're eating from your supplier. If they're wild discus and they don't really have a history of eating any particular food except for what they would get in the wild, the best thing to do is to offer them up a variety of foods, and they won't starve themselves to death unless there's something wrong with them. If there's something wrong with them, they have a disease, a parasite, or anything like that, then they may not eat for long periods of time. They may hide in the back of your tank. A good healthy fish is not going to do that. A good healthy fish is going to accept foods within 7 to 10 days at the most. I've seen fish go as long as 14 days without eating, and then I've had to crank the temperature up in the tank to get their metabolism up, and they're eating well. So what you want to do is offer up a variety of foods such as flake, good high quality flake that is high in omega-3s. You want to get pellets that's same thing, high in omega-3s, has a lot of vitamins and things in there that are good for your fish. You want to get some frozen foods. I recommend some brands. I'll put them in the bottom down here. I don't want to mention them in the video because I'd just be going through a whole bunch of different brands here. But if you are going to be feeding some frozen foods, it's important that you get some high quality frozen foods that are for sure free of any kind of parasites. Parasites can live in frozen foods for a long period of time, and that can be a real problem. So you want to buy from someone who guarantees you on the package that these are parasite-free foods that you are feeding. And then again, as I said, live foods. If you're going to give your fish live foods, make sure that you're getting them from a reputable supplier. Typically, if you're giving them blackworms aren't going to have too many problems or issues that come with them. But redworms, I would just stay away from altogether. There's just too many chances of red bloodworms being a parasite carrier, and you're just passing that on to your fish. Now, one of the things that people ask me also is kind of a schedule on when you should feed your fish. Now, I feed my fish twice a day. I don't feed them any more than that, and I don't feed them any more than what they can eat in 3 to 5 minutes. Now, this is something that's kind of a standard in the industry. I've actually gotten to the point where I look at what my fish are eating and how long it basically takes them to eat what I think is a pretty generous quantity of food, and then I look at the overall health of my fish over a period of time to make sure that they're staying nice and healthy by being stout and not overly heavy, because you don't want that either. That can be a huge problem in itself. But if you can get away with feeding your fish a couple of times a day, a variety of foods, what I like to do is in the morning come in to my fish room here and take a look at my fish, do a health check on them. I do that every single morning just to make sure that there's nothing going wrong, make sure that all of my fish are accounted for. Now, you can't do that with every single tetra that might be in your tank, and of course tetras can die, and it may be a few days before you miss them. That is something that just happens. But getting back to the feeding part of this, what I like to do is a health check on my fish and then give them a feeding in the morning. Typically what I will do is give them some pellet and some flake foods. That way the discus fish in this particular tank, for example, are getting the pellets that they need that are big enough and healthy for them, and the tetras in the tank are also getting food by getting the flake that I'm putting in the tank. Now, in the afternoons, what I like to do is do pellets and frozen food together, and that gives them a variety of food that I think is healthy for them and gives them all of the nutrition that they are going to need. Now, the biggest question I get is, how do you know how much to feed your fish? Well, like I said, over a period of time, if you are looking at your tank and you're looking at your fish and you're feeding them, anything that they're eating within 3 to 5 minutes is plenty enough. Anything else, you're just following up your tank. If you're doing regular water changes, that's a great thing to be doing. As I mentioned in all of my videos in the past, if you can do 2 to 3 water changes a week, 30 to 40%, that's fantastic. If you can only do 2 a week, that's still fantastic. It's great for your fish, and your fish are going to do just fine. I have the ability, because I work out of my house, I am able to feed my fish pretty much anytime I want to. I do try to stay on a schedule simply because the fish expect that, and it also works out great for me. Another question that I get all the time is, should I have someone be caring for my fish while I'm gone? Well, that depends on how long you're gone for. If you're going to be gone for 2 or 3 weeks to Europe, or you're going across country to visit family and you're going to be staying a couple of weeks, yeah, you're going to need somebody to come in and feed your fish. If you are taking a weekend or a long weekend, even 2 to 3 days, something like that, I would much rather that you starve your fish for that 2 or 3 days, so as not to follow up your tank by having someone come in and overfeed your fish because they're afraid they're not feeding them enough. And you can show them You can tell them, 50 times how to do it, and they're always going to look and say, well, geez, I don't know if I'm feeding them enough. The bottom line is less is more, and I believe that if you're going away for a 2 to 3 day weekend, it's important to understand that your fish are not going to be harmed by not being fed. In that period of time, fish can go a long time without being fed, and they don't need to be fed every single day. If you are going on a weekend vacation, or like I said, a 2 to 3 day weekend vacation, anything more than that, I would certainly find somebody that you can depend on, that's not going to overfeed, someone that maybe has had experience with your fish room before and knows how to feed them. Leave them specific instructions on how to feed your fish so that they don't make mistakes. And there's ways of doing that. You can color code your tanks if you have multiple tanks, and that gives them an idea of whatever that color is on the little chart, what they get and how many times a day they get that food. And for each tank it may be different, so it's important that you write instructions out to people if you are going to be out of town for an extended period of time. This is the best way to do that, and find somebody that has a little bit of knowledge about the hobby and not someone that's just a neighbor that doesn't know anything about fish. Another thing that I'm going to tell you that's a little bit interesting that I do, I like to have a switch right near my tanks that is specifically for the pumps, that I can click it off really quick and still have the bubbles going, still have my lights on so that I can see, but then feed my fish when there's no water movement at all in the tank. And the reason for that is I can feed the fish at this end of the tank or this end of the tank, and I can find that that food is getting into a specific area. It's not getting all into my plants or the center of the tank where the food is hard to get, and that way I know that the food is being consumed and there isn't a lot of waste going on in the tank. That's something that you can set up. It's really easy to do. As I said, just make a extension cord that has a small switch built into it that is specifically for the pumps in your tank, and you can click that off really quickly. The thing you want to do is make sure that you do turn those pumps back on, because I've had people do this, and I'm going to do a disclaimer on this. I don't want you to do this unless you are setting a timer on your phone or something like that that's within an hour of the time that you're feeding, to remind you to go and check to make sure you have turned that switch back on, because I've done it myself. I'm not perfect, and I have certainly done it myself. So it's really important that if you're going to feed this way, which I think is the best way to feed, because it, like I said, it reduces the amount of waste in your tank and reduces the amount of food that does not get consumed. So it's important to me to do it that way. You don't have to do it the way I'm talking about, but if you can, I really, really recommend it, because it is a really interesting way to feed your fish and make sure that you're reducing the amount of waste. Clarity in your water, clean water, especially if you're not someone that can do 3 water changes a week and you can only do 2. It's really important that your water quality remains high, and that's one way to keep that water quality high, by making sure that the food is being consumed. Everything that's going in your tank is being consumed. Now, I have looked at the diet of fish and read a lot about it, and one of the things that I have found is that there are no specific foods out there that are 100% better than others. Of course, you do get what you pay for, so I want you to understand that. If you're buying really cheap, crappy flake foods and pellets, you're really not giving your fish the best nutrition that they deserve. So what I would tell you is buy some middle of the road type foods that are going to be high in nutritional value for your fish, and that way you know that you're at least giving your fish as much as they probably need to get them by. Now I go overboard with that and I buy much higher end type foods, probably something that I don't need to do, but psychologically it makes me feel better and it makes me feel like I'm treating my fish the best that I possibly can by giving them the best quality food that I possibly can. Thank you for joining me today. I hope I answered some of your questions on feeding. And again, I don't like these automatic feeders. If you absolutely feel like you have to have one, buy a good quality one and make sure that the thing works correctly, because these things tend to have a lot of problems. And I just don't use them. I just really don't use them, and I don't recommend them to other people. So I wanted to put that in there. But again, thank you for joining me today. Leave your comments down below if you have a question that's specific to this video. I would be glad to answer it. Like I say all the time, I try to get back to people within 24 hours on any question that they leave for me. If it's an older video, I may not see it for a while, but I do go back and check in my comment section of YouTube where I may have missed something from someone, and I try to get back to them even if it's down the road a ways. I apologize that I can't answer every single question, but I try to get back to people as best I can. So thank you for joining me. As I said, please be careful about feeding and try to have a little bit of knowledge and understanding about what you're doing, because it is a very important aspect of the hobby. It has everything to do with the cleanliness of your tank. It has everything to do with the health of your fish, and it also has a lot to do with how much money you are spending on this hobby on a weekly or monthly basis. So please like this, give me the thumbs up on it, like the video, subscribe, comment as I said, and share with your friends, because that's how this channel grows. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining me today. Until then, we'll see you on the next one. Enjoy the hobby.